Picture this. It's August 1947, and somewhere in a dusty government office in New Delhi, a British civil servant named Cyril Radcliffe is hunched over maps with a magnifying glass, drawing lines with a ruler. He's never set foot in Punjab or Bengal before this assignment. He doesn't speak Hindi, Urdu, or Bengali. Yet here he is, quite literally drawing the future borders of two nations with a pencil and 5 weeks to spare before his boat home. If that doesn't capture the absurd tragedy of partition, nothing will. The air that summer hung thick with more than monsoon humidity. It carried the weight of centuries-old grievances, the metallic taste of impending violence, and the desperate prayers of 400 million people who were about to discover that their homeland would be carved up like a wedding cake nobody wanted to share. This is the story of how the jewel in Britain's crown became two bloodied nations, and how ordinary people, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and grandmothers, found themselves refugees in their own subcontinent overnight. To understand partition, we need to rewind to the 1940s, when the British Empire was hemorrhaging money, dignity, and patience. World War II had left Britain looking rather like a boxer who'd won the fight but lost several teeth in the process. The empire that once boasted the sun never set on it was now desperately trying to figure out how to turn off the lights and lock up before the creditors came knocking. Enter the Indian independence movement, which by this point had evolved from polite requests for home rule into a full-blown national awakening. Mahatma Gandhi, with his spinning wheel and stubborn refusal to wear proper British attire to meetings, had turned nonviolence into an art form that made the colonial administrators deeply uncomfortable. Nothing quite ruins your imperial swagger like being morally outmaneuvered by a 70-year-old man in a loincloth. But here's where our story takes its tragic turn. The Indian National Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, envisioned a united, secular India where Hindus and Muslims would share power like reasonable adults at a dinner party. The Muslim League, under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had different ideas entirely. Jinnah, once called the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, had grown increasingly convinced that Muslims would become second-class citizens in a Hindu-majority India. By 1947, he was demanding a separate nation, Pakistan, meaning land of the pure in Urdu. The British, displaying their characteristic talent for making things worse while trying to make them better, decided the solution was simple: divide the subcontinent along religious lines. What could possibly go wrong with sorting 400 million people into neat religious categories and drawing arbitrary lines through ancient communities? Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, announced that independence would come not in 1948 as originally planned, but in August 1947. Suddenly, the timeline for creating two nations had shrunk faster than a wool sweater in hot water. Radcliffe, our unfortunate boundary commissioner, was given 5 weeks to dissect a subcontinent, He worked with census data, maps that were often decades out of date, and what can generously be called educated guesses about where different communities lived. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Radcliffe was essentially performing surgery with a butcher's knife, trying to separate communities that had been intertwined for centuries like the roots of ancient trees. Villages that had existed as single entities found themselves split down the middle. The town of Malda ended up with its railway station in India and its main market in East Pakistan. Farmers went to sleep in India and woke up in Pakistan, or vice versa, without moving an inch. But the real tragedy wasn't in the bureaucratic bungling. It was in the homes of ordinary people who suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of history's pencil line. Take Kana Devi, a schoolteacher in Lahore, who had lived her entire life in the same house her grandfather built, only to discover she was now a Hindu minority in what would become Pakistan. Or Muhammad Hassan, a blacksmith in Amritsar, whose family had forged tools for Sikh farmers for 3 generations, now facing the reality that he was a Muslim in what would be India. The announcement of partition unleashed communal violence that swept across the subcontinent like wildfire. Neighbors who had shared wells and wedding celebrations for generations suddenly saw each other as threats. The same streets that had echoed with children playing cricket now witnessed unspeakable horrors. Trains that had once carried families on pilgrimages arrived at their destinations filled with corpses. Between 10 and 12 million people became refugees, the largest mass migration in human history. They traveled on foot, in bullock carts, in overcrowded trains, carrying their entire lives in bundles on their heads. Many left everything behind: ancestral homes, family graves, the mango trees they had planted as children, the temples and mosques where they had prayed, the shops where they had haggled over the price of vegetables. The human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest 200,000 people died in the violence, though the real number was likely much higher. Women bore particular brutality, with an estimated 75,000 abducted, raped, or murdered. Entire families chose to jump into wells rather than face the mobs. The Punjabi phrase train se Anna, arriving by train, became a euphemism for the traumatic refugee experience that would haunt families for generations. As we drift towards sleep tonight, spare a thought for those millions who lost not just their homes, but their very sense of place in the world. Partition wasn't just about drawing lines on maps. It was about severing the invisible threads that had woven together a civilization. The evening calls to prayer and temple bells that had once harmonized across shared courtyards fell silent, replaced by the echo of empty spaces and the ache of remembering. The subcontinent that emerged from 1947 bore scars that remain tender even today. Yet somehow, amid all that darkness, ordinary people found extraordinary ways to begin again. They rebuilt their lives, One brick, one relationship, one cup of tea at a time, proving that human resilience is perhaps the most reliable constant in our messy, beautiful, tragic history. Sleep well, knowing that even in our darkest chapters, the simple act of starting over remains our most profound act of hope.